Welcome to Green Giants, Titans of Renewable Energy, the podcast where insights and innovation meet. Every episode, we dive into conversations with industry leaders, experts, and change makers, bringing you the stories and ideas in the renewable energy sector that shape our world. And now, let's jump into today's episode with your host, Wes Ashworth. Welcome back to Green Giants, Titans of Renewable Energy. Today's conversation goes straight into one of the most important and misunderstood questions behind the energy transition. Where do the materials come from? Our guest is Erica Ocampo, Chief Sustainability Officer at The Metals Company, a company working to develop polymetallic nodules from the deep ocean as a potential source of nickel, cobalt, copper, and manganese. Those metals are essential to batteries, grid infrastructure, manufacturing, and the broader energy transition. Erica brings a rare perspective to this conversation. She started as a music student from Columbia, became a chemical engineer, spent more than a decade at Dow, and led sustainability in the metals recycling world at Sims Limited, and now works in one of the most innovative areas of critical mineral supply. This episode is not about easy answers. It's about trade-offs, evidence, impact, geopolitics, recycling, ocean ecosystems, and what it means to build an energy transition that is not just ambitious, but honest. With that, Erica, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you. This is such an interesting topic that I'm really excited to get into, but we'll start just a little bit of your story and getting to know you a bit. So as I said there, you started out as a music major from Columbia, ended up becoming a chemical engineer and sustainability leader. What part of that journey still just explains how you see the world today?
Well, I will say that there is something incredibly valuable about moving to another country where people speak a different language and operate within a different culture, because you're forced to adapt quickly. And so you learn that communication isn't just about speaking clearly. It's about understanding how others see the world and making sure you understood too. So then I took that even further by moving from music to chemical engineering, which felt like jumping between two completely different worlds. Music taught me creativity, emotional intelligence. Engineering taught me systems thinking and rigor. And that combination still defines how I work today. I'm very comfortable operating in the greater space and translating between people who think very differently.
Yeah, I love that the focus on adaptability, learning to communicate with different cultures and different folks and, making sure that lands correctly. And then also just the combination of creativity and engineering, it feels especially relevant for the kind of complex work you're doing now. And I would say that makes you a rare gem in the world. Not a lot of people can do both of those areas, but I love it. So as through your career, so you've worked in chemicals, plastics packaging, recycling, metals, and now deep sea minerals. What has each chapter sort of taught you that the previous chapter could not?
Well, so I learned that my main role through my different jobs and different companies has been one of translator. Yeah. So in my first job, it gave me this hint because I was basically this technical support that worked between the research teams and the commercial teams, and I was translating technical science into practical language for the customers. But it didn't really click until my second role as an environmental specialist, and I joked that I was basically the environmental police, and I enforced permit compliance, which naturally make people defensive and not love me. But then I started learning the history behind environmental regulations and realized if I help plan team members understand why those rules existed and make compliance feel meaningful rather than punitive, everything will change. And in some cases, there was a little bit competition between operators and engineers about the answers and their knowledge. And so it taught me quickly that people respond better to purpose than enforcement. So I think every chapter of my career has, increased my level of understanding of how it is not only to communicate, but understand others.
Yeah, I love a lot what you said there. And just again, kind of back to that sort of translating, bringing these people together as well. I love the focus there on the purpose, and really tapping into that and finding that as well too. And I think your progression matters too. You've seen sustainability from inside real industrial systems, not just from the outside looking in. And I think gives you just a really unique lens when you've seen so many of those different areas out in the real industry and real world. As we kind of get into this, before we get into a little bit of, the debate and talking through deep sea mining, help us set the stage. So what exactly does the metals company do? What are polymetallic nodules and how do they fit into the energy transition?
So there is this area called the Clarion-Clipperton Zone between Mexico and Hawaii. And at depths of roughly 4,000 to 6,000 meters deep, there are these potato-sized rocks sitting unattached on the seafloor called polymetallic nodules. These nodules contain nickel, cobalt, copper, and manganese, which are metals used in energy, infrastructure, and defense technologies. So TMC has been studying one section of this area of the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, the area called NORID, since 2011. We've been developing collection technology and conducting environmental baseline studies to understand impacts and mitigation strategies before we start operations.
Yeah, I appreciate you setting the stage here. I think the context is important because the phrase deep sea mining can create just an immediate reaction before people really understand what's actually being proposed and what's actually being done. So that gives us a starting point. The metals company, or TMC, is looking at a potential new source of critical minerals. Those minerals sit underneath a huge part of the energy transition. Now I want to step back and talk about the broader materials challenge, because this is where the conversation becomes much bigger than one company or one technology. So a lot of people support the energy transition without thinking deeply about the minerals underneath it. What do you think the average person doesn't understand about its physical reality?
So I think that most people support the energy transition without realizing how metal intensive it actually is. For example, we are expected to mine more copper in the next 30 years than humanity has mined in the last 120 years. That's huge. And it is not just about scale. It's also about concentration. Over 70% of cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. Over 60% of nickel comes from Indonesia. Much of this processing is controlled by Chinese-owned entities. So this isn't just an environmental challenge, huge scale challenge. It's also a geopolitical challenge, an ethics challenge, an affordability challenge. There are many layers to this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such an important point. The energy transition can sound abstract, but it is incredibly physical. And I think it's easy to talk about electrification without really seeing the supply chains and materials behind it. So kind of going back again to your career, so you've spent time in metals recycling, which many people would see as the good guy solution in recycling. But what did that experience teach you about why recycling is essential, but not quite enough?
So working in metals recycling was eye-opening because I went in thinking, this is the solution, right? Yeah. And it is absolutely part of the solution. We need much more investment in recycling, and it's urgently needed. But recycling can only recover materials that already exist in circulation. These metals are often locked inside electric vehicles, buildings, bridges, and infrastructures for decades. So right now, global recycling rates are already pretty decent, like over 60% for cobalt and nickel, and over 50% for manganese and copper. But even if we recycle 100% of these metals by 2050, we will only have reduced new mining demand by about 20 to 30%. So that's how big the demand challenge is.
It's a huge gap. I think the distinction is really useful where recycling is necessary, but it can't carry the entire load by itself. And I think a lot of people need to hear that without feeling like it diminishes the importance of recycling. We need that as well, too, and as much as we can get of it, but it's not enough. So you said, something I think very important to me in a previous conversation is, we can only recycle what we have already mined. What does that really mean for nickel, cobalt, copper, and manganese over the next 20 to 30 years?
So copper is one of the materials we had mined for a long time. And even then, we have to mine so much more coming up. So I'm just going to give you a point of reference. Between 2017 and 2024, we have a huge exponential growth in many minerals, like lithium and cobalt production increased by 3.5 and 2.4 times, respectively. Nickel production grew 71% during that time frame. So even after ramping up production so significantly during the time, by 2040, it's expected that the demand for these materials will increase even more. We're talking 11 times for manganese, more than 7 times for nickel, more than 4 times for cobalt, more than 3 times for copper. So to contain climate change, more critical metals will need to be mined in the next 30 years than have been extracted throughout all human history.
Yeah, it helps explain why this is not just a values conversation, it's also a timing and scale conversation, and just kind of dealing with the reality of what's there. So when people say, and I know we've started to touch on this, but I just want to bring it home. So when people say, why not just reduce demand, substitute materials, and just recycle more? What part of that argument do you agree with? And where does it run into the limits of time scale and physics that we've started to get into?
So I actually agree with parts of that. So we should absolutely reduce wasteful consumption. I mean, and we as consumers have the power to be more mindful and thoughtful about the decisions we make, the use of resources we make. Simple decisions, like, do I need to drive here instead of taking public transport? Do I need to ask a bazillion questions to AI? Do I need to save this many photos? Simple questions like that. But a lot of future demand, when we say reduce demand, most of that demand will come from developing countries trying to improve the quality of life. And that's an ethical question, right? It is difficult to tell them, hey, you should stop developing. But so it's kind of a balance. Then substitution is important too. Like, let's find a replacement. But many of these minerals work across different applications. So not only most substitutions take years to develop, commercialize, and scale, assuming that the market will adopt them, but also they might not work for all the applications. So, and many of those are not true replacements, right? It might be just kind of an additional solution. So this is a portfolio challenge, and there is not just one solution this material is going to fix it all. Yeah. So it is a moving force of a huge established supply chain that needs to be transforming.
Yeah, I appreciate the framing because it avoids turning us into a false choice between recycling and new supply. I say this literally on the show all the time, but it is an and, not an or. We need all of it. We need it and both of these things, and a lot of different technologies, a lot of different solutions. And I think sometimes people just look for that magic bullet, like thing that's just this perfect solution, and it just doesn't exist. Maybe it will one day, but we've got to start where we are today. So I think that's really, really important. So I'll change a little bit to China's role, because I think their role in mineral processing is central to this story. How should energy transition leaders think about the fact that critical mineral supply chains are not just environmental systems, but they are geopolitical systems?
So this was one of the biggest wake-up calls in recycling. China intentionally spent decades, and they told us, building dominance on minerals supply chain and the mining part and processing. And today controls well over half, directly or indirectly, of mining and processing for copper, nickel, cobalt, lithium, graphite, rare earth metals, you name it, they own it. So that level of control over such a critical mineral supply by any country, in particular one that we have challenging relationships with, can be used, and it has been used as a negotiating chip. So this is something that I think people are realizing more because geopolitics are playing such a big role in today's society. So I think this is one layer of the story that I think is getting more attention now.
Yeah, it's where this becomes much bigger than procurement or sustainability. It's a reminder that supply chains are not neutral. They shape power, risk, and resilience. I think it's always important that we look at just the whole holistic picture, all these factors and all the things that come into play. So appreciate you highlighting that. We're looking at too, ore grades are declining. We talked about demand is rising and it will continue to rise. Many land-based resources are located in biodiverse or socially vulnerable regions. How do you weigh the environmental and human costs of the status quo?
So for those listeners that don't really know what ore grade means, it means that the valuable thing that you extract, you need to extract a lot more of the whole waste for you to get that piece that you want. Today, you out of like everything that you extract, only 2% is less than 2% is valuable material, and that is the grade that it continues to decline. So mines is less than 1%. So everything else becomes waste. So we all know that mining is challenging, and we all can complain about it and still benefit tremendously from it. The reality is that minerals exist where geology places them, not where we want. So, and for nickel and cobalt, that means forest. And can mining be done better? Yes, and should, absolutely. And it has in some facilities. But when you add an exponential demand growth like the one we're seeing, and the need to quickly scale up, it pushes the ability and willingness of these countries and the governments of these countries to enforce the environmental and social protections needed for mining to be done responsibly.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a key point. And I think the reminder that doing nothing, kind of like maintaining the status quo that we're doing now, does not mean there is no impact. In some respects means, there's a worse impact than what your solution has, and kind of looking at like, what's the better solution and the least impact. And so that comparison does matter, because every pathway has consequences, even the ones we're more familiar with or comfortable with. And I think it's important important to hit on that. So for me, the picture is clear here. So demand is growing, recycling matters, but can't close the entire gap in the near term. And the current mineral system already carries real environmental, social, geopolitical costs. And that brings us to the heart of the debate around the metals company, whether deep sea nodules can be part of this answer and how to talk about that without oversimplifying it. So you said, and some of you shared is like your own first reaction to deep sea mining was basically, mining is already hard enough. And now we're, talking about the deep sea. What changed when you kind of got into it more and put your engineer's hat on?
Yeah, that was a real reaction of skepticism. It's like, oh, it's already hard. And now we're going to go to the oceans. Oh my God. So when I look at the engineering of this process, the environmental science, and start looking at the system level comparisons of what it means to do this process for this specific ore in this specific area as compared to the specific terrestrial mining, I realized that the collection of unattached nodules in one of the least biologically productive areas on Earth might deserve serious consideration compared to deforestation or displacement on land. So I think I call myself up too. It's like, oh, you're being such a hypocrite. You're an engineer, you're a sustainability professional, and this is a difficult challenge, but you are well suited to take it on, and you enjoy all modern living technologies. So I decided to face my own dissonance, get fascinated by the science and technology, and decided that this was a good solution to join.
Yeah, I appreciate so much that your starting point was not blind enthusiasm. I love that you're just open to sharing like your real reaction. That makes the conversation to me feel more honest. And that initial discomfort is probably where a lot of listeners began too. So again, I appreciate that a lot. So for listeners out there who have never pictured this before, how does polymetallic nodule collection actually work from the seafloor to the surface? Like what's actually happening there?
So imagine you are 4,000 to 6,000 meters deep. Okay, this is really deep. So there's no light. When there's no light, there's no plants. The entire plant kingdom is gone. And then there is high pressures, low temperatures, and most of life there exists in the form of bacteria. Very unique bacteria. There is a collector vehicle that pushes water jets parallel to the seafloor to dislodge and lift these nodules, which are sitting unattached on that sediment seafloor. And then it passes over them and sucks them into a chamber that separates the nodules from the sediment that wasn't shelled with them. Most of the sediment is discharged towards the back of the vehicle, and the nodules, with less than 5% of that remaining sediments, are sent through a riser pipe to a surface vessel, a ship, where then is the water and then is getting ready for transportation for onshore processing.
Yeah, the visual is really helpful because it makes the concept so much more concrete. And to me, as you're going through that, it's so like non-invasive and water going underneath them. They're unattached. Like to me, that sounds like a pretty, good solution. That's not, when you think about traditional mining, there's a very different picture emerges. But the picture you're painting, it's kind of like, okay, that doesn't sound bad at all. And so I think once people can picture the process, they can engage with the risks and trade-offs more thoughtfully. So the technology, you've just explained it, it can sound deceptively simple, right? Like almost like a vacuum cleaner on the seafloor, but operating, as you said, 4,000 to 6,000 meters deep. And you said sort of light. Anything else that kind of makes that environment so difficult?
Yeah, first of all, the ocean is humongous. And even if you think a vessel is big, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean is like a little dot. It's like nothing. And so you are working not only with the challenges of high pressure and low temperatures to have that collector vehicle operate at that depth, but then maintaining the riser pipe that is tethered between the collector vehicle and the vessel on the surface. They need to align constantly. And then you have the ocean moving. And so to keep it aligned and to keep like this dynamic positioning between the both of them is quite remarkable.
It really is. It's fascinating because the concept may sound simple, but the operating environment is anything but simple, and it really puts the engineering challenge into perspective. So TMC often frames nodules as a complementary solution, not a silver bullet, which we've talked about a little bit. What's your take on that? Like, what's the most honest version of that claim?
And I love that claim because, oh my God, we always look for the savior. I think all these movies have in our mind that we're going to find one hero, but actually each of us can be heroes in a small way. So the most honest version will be that DSM is not going to end terrestrial mining. It is not going to address all the metal needs. We are really specific about the minerals found in these nodules in this area: nickel, cobalt, copper, manganese, and some rare earth metals. So The challenge is still humongous. Yeah. This is one piece of the puzzle that we can help solve.
Yeah, it's an important distinction because the energy transition, as you said, has had too many silver bullet narratives, already. Mentally, I think we're conditioned just to think that way, whether it's from movies, as you said, they're like, hey, this hero comes in and saves the day. But to your point, I love that. Like, we can all be heroes. We can all have our piece of the puzzle and making this work. It is all needed. It's all necessary. So I really like that framing because it leaves room for multiple solutions instead of forcing everything into one answer. I think the other thing people get wrong too is just they want this perfect answer right away. And that's not how progress really works. You start with a solution, you make that solution better, you find alternative solutions that are a little better, and then slow improvement continues to happen and happen and happen. Eventually, you end up down the road and you're like, wow, can't believe we were ever there. But it's hard, you can't just jump there and skip steps. Kind of getting more into this, so the strongest critics of deep sea mining argue that we should not industrialize one of the least understood ecosystems on Earth. If you were sort of steel manning their case, what's the best argument against your own industry? Like, what's your take on a little bit of that?
So I think that critics raise valid concerns, but saying don't industrialize the least understood ecosystem on Earth is an overly broad statement. The ocean covers 70% of Earth. About 70% of that is abyssal plains, which is where these nodule fields sit. And NORI-D, the specific NORI-D area, is one of the most studied abyssal areas in the Pacific Ocean. So we should debate specifics, no broad slogans.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I think that kind of answer just builds trust because it shows you understand the strongest version of the concern. And I think it's important for listeners to hear that criticism taken seriously rather than brushed aside and kind of just talking through it honestly and openly. And it's amazing anybody that hasn't seen it, if you look at the globe and you look at that other side of the globe, where the land isn't, it is just massive, that perspective is rarely shown, but it is essentially all water. So the research around TMC's 2022 NORI-D collector trial shows real impacts and directly disturbed tracks, including reduced, macrofaunal density and species richness, while plume impacts appear more nuanced and site-specific. I guess, how do you interpret that evidence responsibly without minimizing it or overstating it?
So I will start by saying that every extractive industry in the world is going to have an impact on the receiving environment. So that's what we went to test. So when we collected the nodules from these fields, we are effectively changing one ecosystem type to the abyssal plains comes with nodule fields and without nodule fields. So we're changing a type of nodule field to one without nodule field, even though it's still abyssal plains. So we are effectively making the transformation. What was so important about this pilot trial is that it helped us create confidence in the modeling we have to be able to adapt the system, the technology of collection, to continue to minimize impact. So there are different levels of impact influence. So the most impact we have is right on the tracks because the collector vehicle doesn't sit digging, it has some buoyancy and it still leaves some tracks about 3 to 5 centimeters deep. So that's probably the removal of the collector, and that track is the biggest impact. But then the sediment was a concern about how far it could travel. And then we learned how far it can travel, how actually impacts because it travels. And we learned that it doesn't travel as far, that the seafloor, when we came back a year later to see how the receiving environment adjusted to the impact we created a year prior to that. And we see a lot of encouraging results because the receiving environment is adjusting and adapting and recovering at a much better rate than we expected. So this is still a lot more information to be done once we have a process happening. And then when we say we're going to start operating, we mean we will continue this research program to continue to understand the impacts of an operations in this environment. But the results are very encouraging. I will not try to tell people that there is no impact, but I will say, oh my God, it's so much less impact.
Yeah, absolutely. The nuance matters. I think the serious conversation is not impact or no impact. It's what kind, how much, where, and compared to what. You're talking 3 to 5 centimeters, as you said, like not a lot there. But I appreciate that because it's exactly where the conversation needs precision instead of slogans. What level of impact is acceptable? Who gets to decide? And what evidence should be required before commercial scale up from your perspective?
It's a good question. I mean, to me, my personal self without the engineering hat is like no impact should be allowed, but obviously my existence alone is impacting the planet. That said, I think we we have processes, existing processes in terrestrial, which show kind of a baseline of what the current impact is. So I think anything new should be lower than that, right? That should be like this threshold of acceptance. And to me, it's not a hard threshold, right? Then when it comes to the evidence, so that depends who you ask. If you ask business and governments, they are going to tell you we need to base the decision on risk. And that's what we're doing. We are assessing all the risks. We're looking at the likelihood of those risks to happen. We are creating mitigating strategies to minimize those risks and the impact of those potential risks. And if they are acceptable and manageable, then that's when you can start doing commercial operations. So who gets to decide that? I think it depends who you ask, because if you are a scientist, I guess the answer will be, I need absolute scientific certainty, which, by the way, we have not achieved on any terrestrial ecosystem either. But it depends who you ask. But if you ask businesses and governments, it will have to be risk-based.
Yeah, it's a really good perspective to consider, and looking at it as risk-based. I like that analogy. I think a lot of things are just kind of balancing that and risk reward and just kind of minimizing it, finding an acceptable solution, and really kind of striking balance. And I think that's where it's at. The environmental debate is central, as we covered there, but not the whole story. So you brought up something that often gets missed is the human and social impacts of the materials we already use. We sort of briefly touch on that, and just a rare opportunity to build guardrails before a new industry scales, which, can be an exciting opportunity. So I want to move there next. So you've said the social impact piece often gets missed because there are no human communities living on the abyssal seafloor. What social impacts of land-based mining do you think people fail to see?
I'm not going to say that terrestrial mining is all evil and brings all negative, because it also brings positives to the communities, right? Economic, jobs, education, these kind of things. But definitely has a long history of severe environmental and social impacts, that makes this ethos of the energy transition kind of challenging. So resource extraction by nature is going to be a destructive process that often starts with the displacement or change the land use of these areas for local communities and indigenous peoples. So depending on the location, depending on the protections that a government gives, because these are different jurisdictions, we kind of start looking at, mountains flatten, or as we talk about all these mine waste, because only a little piece is what we're looking and everything else becomes mine waste. So you have to create these mine waste dams and tailings. And if it's in a tropical area, it's going to rain, and it is very hard to contain all these things. And that means there's going to be pollution of the water resources, of the air for local communities, creating health issues. We're talking also some conflict, right? If the communities are not supported, there has been a lot of conflicts. There might be dam failures, as you have seen sometimes on the news, that the containment of all this mine waste kind of erodes entire area below that dam. Many people have learned about child labor in places like the DRC. So that's one of the worst cases, right? Or the blood diamonds, as people talk. So we talk about human rights abuses, shortening the lifespans of miners, and even the loss of life. So there are a lot of different challenges that people don't see or understand because it's not in their backyard. But for example, if we bring this topic to the U.S., a report by MSCI found that the majority of the U.S. reserves for critical metals are located within 35 miles of Native American reservations. Mm-hmm. And there's something that gives you pause, right? Because it doesn't have to be that a mine is going to damage everything, but the guardrails have to be there to ensure it's done responsibly. And for that, you need a strong enforcement and partnership with the local communities.
Yeah, there's so much to consider there. And I'm curious, just in your role and with your expertise, just how do you talk about harm across such different systems? So you mentioned there are a few, like a rainforest, a mining community, a supply chain controlled by geopolitics, and a deep ocean ecosystem with organisms most people will never really see. How do you just talk about that, and how does that come across when you're communicating?
It is really challenging, and it depends on how much time people give me, right? Because talking of many layers of this mineral supply chains challenge takes time, but most people are not going to invest that kind of time. And so they usually gravitate towards the one area that is most relevant to them. And for most people, that is the environmental part. And that's why I think TMC spends so much time providing comparisons between our NORI-D project and key terrestrial routes, but it really is challenging, and we continue to miss the points of the discussion today because it requires time to be able to explain.
Yeah, I've said it a lot, but how just important communication and education is, to what we're doing and our future going forward. For me, like, this is one of the hardest parts of sustainability. It's comparing things that don't fit neatly on the same scale and kind of how you address them and talk about them. But, it sounds like challenges not only just measuring harm, but also communicating it responsibly. And I think that's always a key theme there. So, one of the other hard questions here is whether deep sea mining reduces harm, shifts harm, or creates a new category of harm. How do you think about that distinction? Like, what's your take on that?
So I wouldn't have this question as a deep sea mining overarching question. I will have it a very specific question, right? So I will say TMC NORI-D polymetallic nodule project reduces harm. And yes, this reduced harm is now in a different ecosystem than, let's say, a nickel mine in Indonesia. But I wouldn't say that necessarily creates a new category of harm, because what is look at harm from the pathway is we look at the pathways of creating harm. And this is specific to the projects. So you start looking at the risk assessment part of, okay, what are the potential risks? What is the likelihood of the risk? But also you need to look which resource, in this case, nodules, operated or collected by whom, the TMC with this technology. And that's when we can assess what are the potential pathways of harm and therefore assess it. And that's why I will say that for this project, we will be reducing harm.
Yeah, I agree. I think, am I 100% right? And no, I have my opinions. I'm wrong as much as the next person, but I agree. It feels to me like it is reducing harm when you really look at it, you analyze the facts and kind of see what you're doing and the impact. I mean, I think that distinction is really important. So another thing that we started to touch on is you came to TMC partly because this is a chance to help shape the guardrails before an industry really starts, which really is an option to do. What guardrails do you believe must exist from day one?
Well, this is one of the things that excites me the most about being part of a new industry. I mean, how many times we have this opportunity? And so we have the opportunity to do all these guardrails before we scale up. So we can do the opposite that other industries have done, which is an afterthought. So we can have the requirements of strong environmental monitoring. We can demand for adaptive management systems to be happening and use all the new technology. We can demand for higher transparency. There is a pretty cool system that we have that will allow anybody from any computer to check where we are and what we're doing when we're operating. We can, start talking about what is the level of science and who is going to be doing which part, what are the standards, what are the guidelines, how things should be collected, and setting up the clear thresholds of operating. So one of the things I really like of being part of TMC is that we will likely be the first company to collect nodules in the seafloor. That means that we have the opportunity to raise the bar high. So not only is an environmental protection, but it's a competitive advantage, right? To set the threshold, the bar high. And that excites me because then we can have like real impact, not only for NORI-D, but for the industry overall.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is one of the most interesting parts of the story. And as you said, most industries build guardrails after the fact. It's kind of historically how it's happened. It gives me some hope for where we are now. As a society, we're starting to really think about these things before these industries really even get built and scaled out, of setting these guardrails early and often. So I love that. And I think listeners will appreciate hearing what accountability should look like before, commercial scale arrives, just in general. So you have built ESG systems and sustainability reporting structures in large, complex companies. How do you build an ESG system for a company that is still pre-commercial, but already facing real scrutiny?
So you build for where regulations are going, not where they are today. So the amount of ESG data reporting requirements continues to increase. So right now we work with each team, including our partners like OCs. So they have finance, strategy, operations, social engagement, and we show them what it is to come, what is the goal that we have as a company. And then we agree with them on a timeline for their yearly data improvements. And by them knowing that this is what is needed and the timeline, enables them to proactively include these data points into their processes. We also are including language with a specific data points needs in our key supplier contracts. So I love it because then I don't have to go back to systems and retrofit them. Yeah. Now that they're building them, they can include this from the start.
Yeah. And how complicated is that? Like building it for sort of future, you kind of got to get out your crystal ball and look at the data and know where it's headed. Like, how do you strike that balance in finding like how to plan for even where it's headed in the future?
The good thing about being with a company that is science driven is that data, we have a platform that has every single data point we have collected of this environmental research program. So data management and understanding all our impacts are just embedded within what we do. So I think we're already overdoing it, the data point space. I think most of the more difficult things to the crystal ball is okay, the governance files, the governance teams, employee data, talking about, policies for the company, this kind of things. We have to set goals and ambitions. So it's not a crystal ball, perhaps. It is more of a target. So it forces us to set a target ahead of operations to know which direction we travel.
Yeah, I like that. Great perspective there. And you touched again on governments. I know the governance debate is intense, right? Especially with the International Seabed Authority process and TMC's U.S. permitting pathway. Without getting too lost in sort of legal detail, how do you personally think about the difference between what is legal, what is legitimate, and what earns trust?
So the ISA, the International Seabed Authority process, has taken over a decade without resolution. And that's quite disappointing. So knowing that the U.S. did not ratify this treaty and develop through a robust process something called the Deep Sea Bed Hard Minerals Resource Act, DSRA, which predates this international treaty, makes me supportive of a permitting pathway through the U.S. And I think trust needs to be earned by actions, no words or legal arguments. So I believe that the over $300 million and over a decade that TMC has invested in the last decade to research this specific area of NORI-D and develop the most robust environmental impact assessment provides a first step into earning this trust. And the next will be starting with small operations, gathering more data and being transparent about what we find. And this will hopefully continue to earn us trust and build the confidence to scale up operations.
I love that focus on trust. I think that distinction between permission and trust is huge. In a legal pathway can answer one question, but legitimacy asks something much deeper. And to your point, you're like building that trust, a step at a time. One other thing you've shared with me, so you've talked about kind of feeling a little disappointed when people you thought were on the same sustainability team attacked imperfect solutions. And we do see this in the industry. How has that changed the way you engage with NGOs, critics, and other sustainability professionals?
Yeah. At the end of the day, regardless of what we do professionally, we are all humans finding our place and happiness in this world. And while in the sustainability professionals world, we might share a similar vision when we do it on broad strokes, we can disagree on the pathways. And that reminds me of this book written by Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And it gave me a better perspective of our individual human coding. And so I decided, what? They don't like my pragmatic approach. This was 10, 15 years ago, right? So they don't like my pragmatic approach because my mind was focusing to, I have these big corporations. If I make this little impact, then it's a huge impact downstream. But it wasn't cool enough. It wasn't attractive enough. And at the time, we were doing these very lofty narrative goals. But then I continued doing that. And I see that pragmatism is now coming back to the sustainability world. And I now understand that, even if we disagree on the ways to arrive to that vision, I have to follow what I know what to do. I need, for me, it's important to bring people together. So instead of making myself righteous, I try to understand the other side that might not be as ready as I am to move faster.
Yeah.
And I push them along because we only going to solve this problem if we bring more people together.
I agree. I mean, if I had to bottle up, what the industry needs to just propel and continue to move forward at a great pace, it's that, and I think sometimes like the emotional side of sustainability leadership doesn't get talked about enough. And, I think we are all very human, focusing on, are we making improvements? Are we getting better versus these, sometimes it's just this, people get so set on one idea or one solution or one pathway. Kudos to you. I think it takes a lot of resilience to keep engaging when criticism comes from multiple directions, and then having humility to just kind of meet them where they are and not be this like, I'm right, type of thing, but to be able to communicate that clearly, I think is more and more what's needed. So throughout here, we've covered difficult terrain, minerals demand, recycling limits, ocean impact, social trade-offs, governments, trust, and the realities of building something new under scrutiny. I want to close by looking forward, because one of the strongest themes from us and having previous conversations were you are seeing that pragmatism return to sustainability, and I am as well too, and I love to see that, and I think that again is more of the path that we need. So as you shared there too, you're starting to see that come back into sustainability. What does healthy pragmatism really look like? And how is it different from compromise that gives away too much?
To me, pragmatism means staying in line with your values while acknowledging real world trade-offs. Yeah. And those real world trade-offs include other people's values. So for example, I love animals and I used to eat meat. That was a dissonance. It was a strong enough value that I decided that dissonance was too unachievable for me to maintain, and I decided to become vegetarian. Is this the solution for every single human? It is not. Also, pragmatisms will indicate that if I want nobody to eat meat, everybody becomes vegetarian today, right? I'm making it a law. That's not really being pragmatic, right? That's me imposing my values into somebody else. So I learned that pragmatism is not about my values, your values. It's not about utopia. It's not perfection. It's no cynicism. It is simply progress.
Yeah, I love that. I think so much wisdom in how you phrase that. And again, I think could do the industry a lot of good if everybody starts buying into that a little bit more and listening to that. So I love that you shared that. That's such a great point there and a great takeaway. So we'll think about this. When the next generation of engineers, sustainability leaders, and energy transition builders kind of look back at this moment, what do you hope they say we got right about minerals, oceans, and just the broader energy transition?
I am so excited about this next generation, right? Because we're opening these new industries and new frontiers and new technology. And as an engineer, I can just think how fun that will be, like to decide what I can do next, being this new techno platform in the world. So I hope they say we were honest about trade-offs, that we accelerated the energy transition while protecting people and planet, and that we stay open to better solutions.
Yeah, I love that. Very, very hopeful place there. And this really is, generational work. And I think the decisions being made now will shape both the infrastructure and the values of the energy transition. I've had a lot of leaders in the space kind of say like, I'm a little jealous that of the generation that's coming into the industry now, like how exciting it's going to be for the next 10, 20, 30 plus years into the future. So I love that. Final question, just an open one. Anything else you would like to share with the audience? Words of wisdom, anything else you didn't get to share about the work TMC is doing? I'll just give you the floor. Anything you want to leave us with?
I will want to say to everybody that feeling discomfort is not bad, that having cognitive dissonance is human nature, but it is our responsibility to be aware of it, to stop, think about it, find the information and resolve it. That it is very easy to be against something, but it is so much more valuable and helpful to be pro something and work towards that. So I have all my different moments where I haven't feel as hopeful, and that's okay, because then it just makes my beliefs stronger and my drive towards working for solutions better.
That's so good. Such a hopeful note to end on. Well, I'll leave it right there. That is fantastic. Erica, thank you so much for joining Green Giants and for being willing to sit inside a conversation that it's complex, tested, and incredibly important. What I appreciated most is you didn't frame it as a perfect answer. You framed it as a real world question. How do we build the energy transition with eyes wide open about materials, ecosystems, communities, geopolitics, and trade-offs? For everyone out there listening, this is exactly the kind of conversation we need more of. Not slogans, not easy answers, better questions, better evidence, and more courage to engage with the uncomfortable parts of building the future. Thanks for listening to Green Giants, Titans of Renewable Energy. If this episode challenged how you think about minerals, oceans, or the energy transition, please subscribe, leave a rating, and share it with someone who would value the conversation. And with that, we will see you next week.
This episode of Green Giants, Titans of Renewable Energy was brought to you by Lee Group Search. If you enjoyed today's discussion and are looking to recruit top talent for your company, or find your next career opportunity in the renewable energy sector, visit leegroupsearch.com. Let's continue driving the future of clean energy together. Until next time, keep pushing toward a greener future.